Okay, this is Kevin Canfield, again, View from the Middle, with our final part, our final edition of Race in America, with my good friend Joseph Wood, Deputy Secretary of the State for the state of Arkansas. And we've talked about background in the very first edition. We've talked about where we are today, and today we're going to talk about solutions. So tell us about some of the solutions to our issues in America.
Sure. Solutions are hard. We can talk about issues all day long, and again, we kind of came out of some of the issues facing us is this whole notion of you still have a large break in the family in the black community, and education is woefully deterring in our black communities. Some of the solutions, though, I think it takes on a four-prong, and not in any one particular order, but it's going to come down to the individual. It's going to come down to our community leaders and churches, and it's going to come down to our nation and our nation as a whole. But I think some of our first part is how do we start making better decisions, making better choices? The sooner we can do that, teaching pulling our families together. When you go back and look at what welfare has done in some circles in particular, I think it has caused more harm than good. Not saying we don't need to have safety nets and we don't need to have things to help, but there was a time when the program just got started in the 60s, 70s, if you will. It was really a help, and people, did not really want it. They went and got part-time jobs and used that welfare to help tide over until they were able to either secure a better job or longer term. But today we've added more things to it. So not only is it taking care of my food and sustenance, it's taking care of maybe my housing, or it gives me a telephone. And so people are now become so used to having it that they become dependent upon it and don't know that they're dependent upon it. So now how do we start trying to help people understand that you can become independent? How do you become independent? Well, when we get you into the workplace. So how do you get to the employment, which is, again, looking at our economy, how do we draw people to entrepreneurism? We were very creative people. When we came here, we had to work. We were broke physically up. Now we're mentally there. How do we break through this mental challenge? And I think, Kevin, some of the ways you do that is, again, you start looking and reminiscing back and not going that far, that you had entrepreneurs who would go out and they had crafts, whether it's their agricultural goods that they're bringing into market and selling it, or whether they started a lawn care services and then growing into something bigger than that. How do we pull community leaders, or even some of our leaders who have done extremely well, and say, hey, how do we seed back into our communities and say, we'll do some crowdfunding? You get the initiative and you get out there and get the skill set, whatever your talent is that you can embrace. We'll help support you and then fund that. You'll pay back some percent of it. They're out there now, but you got to be willing to move beyond where you are to go and get that. Our churches and community. I mean, one of the aspects of the black community has been the black church. Far before we were ever free, there was a certain spirit that we had within us, knowing that one day we would be free, whether it be free in this country or free to go back to, or we'll be free. We'll be taking out our misery and go home with our Lord. I mean, that was something that really drove us. When you see a President Barack Obama come and talk about hope, it wasn't that people elected him because he was black. It was because he talked about hope and what could be in this image of what was possible. Well, that is no longer there, because part of it meant you had to do something as part of that. It just doesn't come. You have to roll up your sleeve. You have to get up and go to school. Mom and dad's going to have to check the homework. They got to be involved with the teachers. So when we start talking about education, how do we start looking at, if you're poor, failing school, we need to have an alternative. So if it's a voucher system, if it's a charter school system, put them in those areas, allow some competition so those best teachers start to rise up. They're committed to those students. Mom and dad, you have an obligation to be involved with your kids, because education in the school is only part of it. Who's teaching them how to think when they're at home? Who's teaching them when they think when they're outside of the school on the playground and they're having to deal with life? So those are some of the pieces that we begin to do to come up with solutions. Pulling players together, when I start thinking about black leaders, we always get to, how do we pull black leaders together, like a Jesse Jackson or Dr. Ben Carson, and say, okay, you guys sit on extreme posts, but we're talking about how do we advance the causes in the black community, and how do we come up with solutions that's going to collaborate, get off the left, get off the right, but collaborate on something that we haven't thought about that's going to move that. Again, a lot of that's going to be individual. It has nothing to do with a Jesse or Dr. Carson. It has something to do with the individual. But when you don't have someone who can work through those processes, having the church, having the community leaders come together, having the state say, here's how we're going to help facilitate that process, begins our road to this solving some of the things that not only the black community, but communities across the country.
And we've talked about bringing jobs to the black community or the black community to the jobs, enterprise zones. Tell me a little bit about that.
One of the things we talked about, Kevin, is you have a challenge because of where we are in our education system, whether you're talking about black, white, or Latin, or whatever, companies, they're in business to be profitable. They're not in it, and so if they're looking at a community to bring let's bring a large car plant to a community, but then they look and see that the illiteracy rate is over 60 and 70%. They're a little nervous and hesitant about that because who's going to be the workforce to run that plant, that car plant? If they see signs that says hazardous materials but doesn't know what hazardous materials are, so now they start looking at another place to go ahead and build their plant. Now, we as a community, as an individual, as a state says, well, what do we need to do, Mr. Car Plant, to build the work skill sets and make sure we're putting the right things in our education system that is going to be a great product, a great benefit to you as a company. So some of that becomes when you start saying, hey, state, we're just going to carve out some zones that we're going to reduce taxes, provide maybe some subsidies for you to come into our particular state to drive employment. We also got to make sure that we have people who are going to be able to do the skills and do the job and be able to do the work. The other point is, if there's a state or a community that actually has jobs and looking, sometimes we got to be mobile and go. If your community is not thriving and the education is woefully poor, do you stay there and continue to go down with it, or do you end up saying, I have some responsibility for raising my family, and say, well, I'm going to go 50 miles a state or whatever to go and take care of my family, and I'll go to this particular place. So I have to be mobile.
And I think we've talked about also one thing about the welfare system did in the past try to divide the family, encourage it, and
Sure.
that we need to stop doing that.
Yeah, and growing up in Chicago, you saw a lot of this. And again, I know it's not just in Chicago, but it was an encouragement. If you had additional kids, you got additional monies in your welfare, another 50, 75, $100, what have you. Nowhere near enough to raise a kid. The other piece was you would not get those benefits if you had the spouse or the husband in the family. So part of it was disincentivizing the family to come together, because you can get paid, you can have things taken care of, your housing and your food, if you didn't have the husband in the household. So again, you're bringing up a generation, and then you saw another generation that saw the same thing. Well, hey, I can have the kid, I can have my house, I can have, and so you built this artificial father called governmental welfare, as opposed to really having the father take responsibility for his actions, as well as the mom to take care of their responsibility. And so anyway, that has been some of the plight of this whole deterioration of the family. And again, small part is the black community who's part of that welfare system, because it is larger than just the black family. But again, it does that same thing to every family that is generation after generation on it.
Man, it's a great point that it really these solutions apply to everybody in
Absolutely.
America, not just the black community.
Absolutely.
And if I was going to recap, I'd probably say, getting black leaders together. I love Ben Carson and Jesse Jackson getting together. We talked about welfare reform. We talked about the importance of education. And we talked about jobs and a couple of different ways to do that.
And we also got to make sure, again, we go back to the individual. At some point, we got to make sure we take a look at ourselves and say, what can I do? How can I do better? Then when I make better decisions, make better choices.
Joseph, enjoyed it.
Kevin, good.
Thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me.